open your eyes, and the first thing you notice is the light. Not bright yet, just a thin gray gold line at the edge of the doorway. And already, even at this hour, the air feels like it's been sitting too close to a fire.
You're lying on a low mudbrick platform built against the wall, with a woven reed mat beneath you and a folded linen cloth that served as both blanket and pillow, depending on the hour of the night. The room is small, 3 or 4 meters across, built of mudbrick, plastered, with a roof of palm logs and matting that does almost nothing against the heat, but at least keeps the sun itself off your head. Through the doorway, no door, just a gap and a hung reed mat. You can hear the village waking, someone grinding grain in a stone mortar, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud that will continue on and off for the rest of the day in 100 houses at once. A donkey complains. Somewhere, a child is crying and being shushed. The smell of bread already baking drifts in, and underneath it, faint but constant, the smell of the river half a kilometer away. Mud, reeds, and water, that is the reason any of this. The village, the project, the entire civilization exists at all.
You sit up, and your back tells you immediately what yesterday was. A dull, deep ache across your shoulders and lower spine. The kind that doesn't go away with sleep, just changes shape. You roll your shoulders. Something pops. You've been doing this for 4 months, this rotation, and your body has stopped being surprised by the pain. It has simply become the baseline against which every other sensation is measured.
The year is roughly 2560 BC, the reign of Khufu, 4th king of the 4th dynasty, and the Great Pyramid. His pyramid, his tomb, his monument to his own transition into the divine, is rising course by course on the plateau above you. It is, at this moment in history, already the largest structure ever built by human beings, and it isn't finished. It won't be finished for years yet. You are living through the construction of something that will still be the tallest building on Earth in 4,500 years, and to you, it is simply where you work.
Let's be clear about something immediately, because it's the single most persistent myth about this place, and it matters. You are not a slave.
The image of whip-driven slave gangs building the pyramids is a much later invention. Greek historians writing 2,000 years after the fact. Looking at these monuments and assuming reasonably enough from their own world that nothing this big could be built any other way. But the archaeology of this very village, excavated extensively in modern times, tells a different story. You are a conscripted laborer, here as part of a rotating labor levy, a system the Egyptians call back, a kind of national service owed to the state that cycles workers through in shifts of a few months at a time. You'll go home eventually. Someone else will take your place. And critically, you're being fed, housed, and paid for this in a system that looks less like slavery and more like a brutally organized state-run public works project with conscription instead of a paycheck negotiation.
That doesn't make it pleasant. It makes it something stranger. An enormous temporary city, perhaps 15 to 20,000 people at peak, built specifically to house, feed, and organize the labor force for one project, then largely emptied out again once that phase of construction ends. Bakeries on an industrial scale, breweries producing thousands of liters, granaries, a cemetery, and the cemetery is important because the workers buried here weren't dumped in mass graves. They were given modest but real tombs, some with inscriptions naming them, some with painted images of the work they did. A man buried near here has a title that translates roughly as overseer of the side of the pyramid, a foreman proud enough of his role to have it carved into stone for eternity. Whatever this was, the people doing it did not, on the whole, regard themselves as disposable.
And yet, not a slave is not the same as this was fine. Hold both of those things at once, because the day ahead of you is going to test that balance constantly.
You eat before you go. And breakfast here is one of the most important transactions of your entire day, because it's also your wage.
Our bread and beer. This is the foundational pairing of the entire Egyptian economy, the literal basic unit of payment for labor at every level of society, from field hands to the men working this plateau. The bread is made from emmer wheat, coarsely ground on stone querns. And here's the detail that will matter again later today. That grinding process leaves grit in the flour, fine particles of stone that end up in every loaf, every day, for your entire life. The bread is dense, slightly gritty, sometimes flavored with dates or herbs depending on what's available. And it is filling in a way that modern bread, with its refined flour, simply isn't.
The beer. And this needs explaining, because it's not what the word suggests to a modern ear. Is a thick, porridge-like, low-alcohol brew, made from fermented bread or directly from grain mash, strained through cloth. It's nutritious, full of B vitamins, calories, and minerals. And it's also, crucially, safer to drink than the river water in many cases, because the fermentation process kills off some of what would otherwise make you sick. You drink it throughout the day, not to get drunk. The alcohol content is low, more like a modern light beer at most, often less. But because it is, in this climate, doing several jobs at once: hydration, nutrition, and a small daily ration of calm in a day that will not offer much else.
Workers here receive an official ration, recorded in some periods on actual administrative documents, because Egyptian bureaucracy at this point in history is already extraordinarily sophisticated. Scribes track grain distribution, labor rotations, tool issue and return, with a level of record-keeping that wouldn't be out of place in a much later century. You are in a very real sense a line item, fed according to a formula, your labor measured, your rations calculated against the work you're expected to produce. It is impersonal in exactly the way a modern payroll system is impersonal, 4,500 years before payroll systems exist.
Step outside, and the village itself deserves a moment, because it's not just a labor camp. It's a functioning town with all the social texture that implies.
The houses are arranged in long galleries, rows of attached mudbrick rooms, barracks-like in layout but with the small humanizing details that show up wherever people live for long enough. A niche for a household god, a grinding stone worn smooth by years of use, children's toys made from scraps of wood and clay. Some workers are here with families, others have left families behind in villages up and down the Nile and will return to them when this rotation ends. The social mix is wide. Unskilled laborers doing the hauling and dragging, skilled stone masons and carpenters who are here permanently as career craftsmen rather than rotating conscripts, scribes managing the logistics, bakers, brewers, butchers, doctors. Yes, doctors, and we'll come back to that, and overseers, the men whose job is to keep all of this moving on schedule under a sun that does not care about schedules.
The social distance between you and the men actually planning this pyramid. The architects, the highest officials, ultimately Khufu himself, is almost unimaginably vast, vaster in some ways than the distance between a Roman tenant and his landlord. Khufu is not just rich. Khufu is, in the theology of this civilization, a living god, the intermediary between humanity and the divine order, the one figure whose existence keeps the sun rising and the Nile flooding on schedule. You will never see him. You will never be in a room he has been in. The pyramid you're building is, among other things, the technology by which he transitions from a god temporarily wearing a human body into a fully divine being who will spend eternity in the company of the sun god Ra. And your labor is part of the machinery that makes that transition possible. It's difficult to overstate how total this hierarchy is. It isn't political in the way Roman class structure is political. It's cosmic. Questioning it isn't rebellion. In the framework everyone here operates within, it would be something closer to questioning gravity.
And yet, within that framework, the village runs on the same human textures as anywhere else. There's a man 2 doors down who's known for telling jokes that are, by the standards of his foreman, not appropriate, and tells them anyway. There's a woman who brews beer that everyone agrees is better than the official ration and trades cups of it for small favors. There's a boy, maybe 10, who already knows he'll be a scribe because his father is one, and who watches the stonemasons with the kind of focused envy that 10-year-olds reserve for jobs that look more exciting than their own future.
The walk to the worksite takes you past the river, and the river every single morning is the most dangerous part of your commute. More dangerous, most days, than the stone itself.
The Nile at this point in history runs closer to the plateau than it does today. A network of channels and canals brings boats almost to the foot of the construction site, because moving multi-ton stone blocks overland is hard enough without adding unnecessary distance. You don't swim across anything most mornings. There are crossings, causeways, boats for the heaviest cargo, but the river and its channels are everywhere in this landscape, and the river means crocodiles. Nile crocodiles at this period are large, common, and entirely unbothered by the presence of a major civilization on their riverbank. They're a genuine, daily, unremarkable hazard. The kind of thing that gets one sentence in a worker's day and an entire funeral in someone's family if it goes wrong. Egyptian religion has an entire god, Sobek, dedicated to crocodiles, worshipped partly out of reverence and partly, frankly, out of the very practical hope that the god might be persuaded to keep his sacred animals away from your legs. Prayer here is risk management, the same way the lararium on the Roman street corner was risk management. Different gods, same instinct. Appease the thing that can kill you.
Hippos too. And hippos are, by a wide margin, more dangerous than crocodiles, despite the reputation gap. Territorial, fast, and aggressive, a hippo can capsize a boat or crush a person without much effort, and Egyptian art is full of imagery of hippo hunts precisely because hippos are a recognized, serious threat to river traffic and riverside life. You don't think about this consciously every morning, the same way a modern person doesn't consciously think about car accidents every time they cross a street. But the awareness sits there, low and constant, part of the texture of living next to a river that gives you everything and occasionally, without warning, takes something back. The worksite itself as you approach it is one of the most extraordinary organized spaces that has ever existed. And it's worth pausing to actually look at it, because the scale doesn't compress into a sentence easily. The pyramid at this stage is perhaps half-built, a stepped mountain of limestone blocks, each course slightly smaller than the one below, rising at an angle that, when finished, will be sheathed in polished white limestone casing stone so bright that the completed monument will be visible, reflecting sunlight from enormous distances. Around its base, a small city of its own. Ramps, scaffolding made from wood and earth, sledges, ropes thicker than your arm, teams of men positioned at intervals up the structure, and overseers everywhere, watching, directing, recording.
How the stones actually got up there is one of the genuinely unresolved questions of Egyptology. And it's worth saying that plainly, because the documentaries that present a single confident answer are simplifying. The leading family of theories involves ramps. A straight ramp extending out from one face of the pyramid, getting longer and shallower as the structure rises, and requiring an almost absurd amount of additional material to build and maintain. Or a ramp that wraps around the pyramid's exterior, spiraling upward, or some combination, with different ramp systems used for different stages and different parts of the structure. Some researchers argue for internal ramps, hidden within the pyramid's body itself, based on anomalies detected by modern scanning technology. The honest answer that you would give if asked is you don't theorize about it. You're not an engineer. You're a man with a rope in a team of men with ropes, and your job is to pull when the foreman says pull, in rhythm with everyone else. And the ramp is just the ground you're standing on today. You have no more reason to wonder about the overall logistics of the ramp system than a modern factory worker wonders about the global supply chain that got the parts to their station.
The blocks themselves come from two main sources, and the difference between them tells you something about the economics of the entire project. The core of the pyramid, the vast bulk of its mass, is local limestone, quarried right here on the Giza Plateau, close enough that the haul distance is short. This is the stone you'll mostly be working with, blocks weighing, on average, somewhere around 2.5 tons, though some are far larger. Quarrying it involves teams cutting along natural fracture lines with copper chisels, wooden wedges soaked with water to expand and crack the rock along intended lines, and an enormous amount of straightforward, repetitive, body-destroying labor, hammering, levering, dragging.
The finer stone. The brilliant white limestone casing that will eventually sheath the entire exterior, and the granite used for the burial chamber deep inside comes from much further away. The casing limestone comes from Tura across the river. The granite, astonishingly, comes from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers south, quarried, loaded onto barges, and floated down the Nile during the flood season when water levels are high enough to make the journey possible. A single granite block for the king's burial chamber might represent a transport operation that took weeks and involved hundreds of people along its route. And you, on the plateau, will likely never see Aswan, never see the quarry, and yet your daily work and that distant quarry are part of the same single machine, coordinated by a bureaucracy that this early in human history is already capable of planning multi-year, multi-hundred-kilometer logistics for a single building.
Now, your actual task today. You're on a hauling team. Roughly 20 men, a sledge, a rope, and a block of limestone that needs to move from the base of the ramp to a position several hundred meters up its length.
The sledge sits on the ground, wood, reinforced, built to take the weight without splitting. Ahead of the sledge's path, other workers are pouring water onto the sand or crushed limestone surface of the ramp. And this detail, confirmed by an Egyptian tomb painting that shows exactly this technique, matters enormously. Wet sand, at the right consistency, dramatically reduces the friction under a sledge, making the difference between a load that's merely brutal to move and one that's functionally immovable. Someone's entire job, today, is managing the wetness of the ground in front of you, and if he gets it wrong, your morning gets measurably worse.
The rope goes over your shoulder and the foreman calls the rhythm. A chant, a count, something that gets 20 men to pull in the same instant. Because a sledge that's pulled unevenly doesn't move smoothly, it lurches, and a lurching multi-tone block on a ramp is exactly the kind of thing that ends careers and occasionally lives. You pull. The rope bites into your shoulder through the linen wrapping you've tied there for exactly this purpose. The sledge grinds forward, a few centimeters, then a few more. Then, as the wet sand does its work, a slow, continuous slide that feels, after the initial resistance, almost like nothing at all, which is the entire point. The engineering isn't in the muscle. The engineering is in the sand.
This goes on, and on. The sun by mid-morning has gone from warm to something that has weight to it. A physical pressure on the back of your neck, on your scalp, on the exposed skin of your arms. Temperatures on this plateau in summer regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius, and you are doing heavy manual labor in it, with a linen kilt as your only clothing, and a wide-reed hat if you're one of the workers who's managed to keep one intact through this rotation. There's no shade on the ramp. There's no shade really anywhere on the worksite, except in the lee of the structure itself. Briefly, depending on the angle of the sun.
The administrative system behind all of this deserves its own moment, because it's one of the most genuinely impressive things about this entire operation, and it's invisible from where you're standing.
Labor here is organized into gangs, groups of workers with names, actual recorded names, things like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, a later pyramid's gang names that have survived, giving an extraordinary glimpse of something close to team spirit, or team humor, in a workforce 4,500 years removed from us. These gangs are subdivided further into smaller units, each with its own identity, competing, informally, but really, with each other for speed and quality, the way construction crews or sports teams do today. Graffiti found on blocks inside the pyramids include these gang names, scrawled by the workers themselves, in red ochre paint, a direct unmediated trace of the individuals who did this, writing their team's name on the stone, the way someone might tag a beam in a building under construction today, for reasons that are recognizably the same. Pride, identity, the simple human need to leave a mark on something enormous that will outlast you.
Above the gangs sit the overseers, and above them the officials who report ultimately to the vizier, the king's chief administrator, the most powerful official in the kingdom after the king himself, and the man who in practice runs this entire project. The taxation system that funds all of this is itself a marvel. Egypt's economy runs on grain, and the state's ability to tax, store, and redistribute grain on a national scale, tracking harvests, predicting shortfalls, moving surplus from one region to feed a project in another, is the invisible infrastructure underneath everything you can see. The pyramid is, in a sense, a visible monument sitting on top of an invisible one, a data and logistics system run by scribes with reed pens and papyrus that is sophisticated enough to feed, house, and organize 20,000 people for years, in a society without writing as we'd recognize it being more than a few centuries old.
You don't see any of this directly. What you see is the rope, the sand, the foreman's count, the block ahead of you on the ramp, and the line of the horizon shimmering with heat that doesn't seem to get any closer no matter how long the day goes on.
By midday, the work pauses, not because anyone has decided to be kind, but because the heat, by this point, makes work genuinely dangerous, and even an operation this large has learned over years of trial and error, where the line is.
You sit in whatever shade exists. The shadow of the pyramid itself, if you're close enough, or a temporary shelter of woven matting on poles, erected specifically for this purpose. Water is brought around, and water here is taken seriously in a way that might surprise a modern visitor, expecting ancient indifference to worker welfare. Dehydration in this climate, doing this work, can kill a man in hours, and a dead worker is a logistics problem as much as a tragedy, from the perspective of the people running this operation. So water comes around regularly, carried in jars from the river or from wells dug near the site, and you drink more of it than you've ever wanted to drink of anything in your life.
The midday meal is more bread, more beer, and, if you're lucky, and rations are good this week, some onions or a piece of dried fish, or a portion of stew with vegetables, leeks, lentils, beans. Meat is rare for ordinary workers. It's expensive, and most of it is reserved for festivals, for the wealthy, or for offerings that, after the religious ceremony, sometimes make their way back into the food supply in a kind of practical theology that no one examines too closely. Onions, though, are everywhere, eaten raw, used in everything, and later found in significant quantities, placed in the eye sockets of mummies, suggesting a symbolic importance that outlasted whatever practical reason first made them a staple.
Now, the teeth. Because if Rome's chapter on the body had one detail that made everyone wince, Egypt's equivalent is, if anything, worse. And it comes from the exact same source: bread.
Egyptian grain is ground on stone querns, and the stone wears down with use, shedding fine particles of grit into the flour. This grit is in every loaf of bread, every single day for your entire life, starting in childhood. The effect on teeth is severe and remarkably consistent across mummified remains. By the age of 30, extensive wear is the norm, with enamel worn down to the dentin in many cases, and by middle age, severe wear, abscesses, and tooth loss are essentially universal among people who've eaten this diet their whole lives. Pharaohs were not exempt. Analysis of royal mummies shows the same grinding-related dental damage as everyone else, which is, in its way, one of the most democratic facts in all of Egyptian civilization. The sand in the bread does not check your rank before it wears down your enamel.
Dental abscesses, in a world without antibiotics, are not a minor inconvenience. They're a genuine cause of death, through infection spreading from the jaw into the skull stream or into the skull. A toothache here isn't an errand to schedule. It's the opening chapter of a story that, often enough, doesn't end well. Egyptian medical texts, and there are several that survive, remarkably detailed. Describe treatments for dental problems, pastes of various ingredients packed against an aching tooth, sometimes including substances with genuine antibacterial properties that the Egyptians had identified through observation, even without any concept of bacteria. It's the same paradox Rome will face 2,500 years later. Real working medical knowledge, arrived at empirically, sitting alongside an underlying cause, the grit in the bread, that no one identifies, because identifying it would require connecting the food I eat to the disease in my jaw across a time scale and a causal chain that simply isn't visible without tools no one here has.
And yet, as with Rome, the gap runs in both directions, and Egyptian medicine, in places, is startlingly advanced for its time.
Surviving medical papyri, documents that are, by the time of Khufu, already drawing on traditions centuries old, describe surgical procedures, the setting of fractures with splints, the treatment of wounds with honey, which,
as in the Norse world, has real antibacterial properties no one here understands chemically, but everyone has learned works, and even what looks to modern eyes like an early grasp of the relationship between the heart and the pulse. With one text describing the heart as the center of a system of vessels reaching every part of the body, startlingly close to a circulatory model arrived at without dissection in the modern sense. Through observation, autopsy-adjacent practices connected to mummification, and an enormous amount of accumulated clinical experience.
On a worksite this size, injuries are constant, and they're treated. Excavations of the workers' cemetery here have found skeletons with healed fractures, including complex fractures that required real, competent setting and immobilization for the bone to heal as well as it did. Evidence of actual medical care being provided to ordinary laborers, not just elites. One skeleton shows evidence of an amputation that the person survived for years afterward. This is not a workforce being worked to death and discarded. It's a workforce that someone, somewhere in this bureaucracy, has decided is worth the cost of repairing when it breaks. Whether out of genuine care, practical economics, or some combination that the people making the decision wouldn't have bothered separating.
The heat itself, though, is the thing that medicine here has the least answer for, because heat illness doesn't look like an injury. There's no wound to treat, no bone to set. Heat exhaustion is, in all likelihood, a routine occurrence on this site. Dizziness, nausea, a kind of gray weakness that workers would recognize in each other and respond to the only way available. Get the person into shade, get water into them, wait. Heat stroke, the more dangerous escalation where the body's temperature regulation fails outright, is almost certainly a real, if not officially counted, cause of death on a project of this scale over years in this climate. There's no thermometer, no diagnostic framework, no IV fluids. There's shade, water, and the accumulated unwritten knowledge of 20,000 people who've all by now seen this happen to someone and learned what helps and what doesn't.
Skin damage from sun exposure over years of this work is severe and visible, and Egyptian cosmetic and medical practice does address this, with various oils and preparations used to soothe and protect skin. The same oil-based logic that runs through Roman bathing culture arrived at independently, for the same reason. In a hot, dry, sun-heavy climate, oil on the skin is one of the few things anyone has that actually helps, even if no one can fully explain why.
The light starts to change in the late afternoon. Not cooler exactly, not yet, but the quality of it shifts. The harsh white of midday softening toward gold, and somewhere in that shift, the work for today ends.
The walk back to the village is slower than the walk out this morning, not because the distance is different, but because everyone's body has spent its budget for the day, and what's left is just enough to get home, eat, and sleep. The river crossing, again in the changing light, and crocodiles in the evening are if anything more active, the heat of the day finally suiting their preferences exactly as poorly as it suited yours.
Dinner is, again, bread and beer, the foundation, unchanging with whatever else the day's rations include. If this is a good week, there might be fish, caught fresh from the Nile and grilled or stewed. The Nile's fish stocks at this point in history are abundant enough to be a real and regular part of the diet for people at every level of society, one of the genuine nutritional advantages of living here. Vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, round out the meal, along with fruit if it's the season, dates, figs, the sweetness of which, after a day like today, registers as something close to a small miracle.
And in the evening, in the time before sleep, the thing that this entire project exists for comes into focus, because it isn't really about the pyramid as a building. It's about what the pyramid is for.
Egyptian religious belief at this period centers on a vision of the afterlife that is strikingly concrete. Not a vague spiritual realm, but a continuation of life, requiring the same things life requires. A body, hence mummification, preserving the physical form as the vessel the spirit will need. Food and goods, hence the offerings. The tomb paintings of banquets and granaries and cattle, which function less as art and more as a kind of cosmic inventory, magically capable of providing forever what they depict. And a place to be, hence the tomb itself. And for a king, the tomb is not a chamber, it's a mountain.
The pyramid is a machine for the king's transition into the afterlife and his ongoing existence within it. An engine, in the most literal sense the Egyptians could conceive, for managing the relationship between this world and the next. Its shape, its orientation to the stars, the pyramids of Giza are aligned with extraordinary precision to true north, and certain internal shafts appear to align with specific stars associated, in Egyptian belief, with the king's destination after death. Its internal chambers, its rituals. All of it is technology, in exactly the sense the Roman aqueduct is technology. A system built with the best available knowledge to solve a problem the society considers absolutely real and absolutely urgent. The problem in this case is, how does a god-king continue to exist and continue to perform the cosmic functions that keep the sun rising and the Nile flooding after his human body dies?
You believe this, not in the modern sense of religious belief as one option among several. This is simply how the world works, as certain as the river flooding every year, as certain as the sun crossing the sky. The pyramid isn't a vanity project to you, even though your own body is paying its construction costs in blisters, sunburn, and slowly worsening joints. It's maintenance, on the same scale as the Lars on the Roman street corner, the amulet on the Norse sailor's chest, but vastly larger because the thing being maintained isn't a household or a ship. It's the entire cosmic order, and the king is the linchpin, and you are, in your own small, exhausted, sand-in-your-teeth way, part of the machinery that keeps the universe running on schedule.
And your own afterlife, because you have one too, even if it's a more modest version of the king's, depends, in part, on tonight's rest, and tomorrow's work, and the slow accumulation of a life that by Egyptian standards counts as having been lived rightly.
Ordinary Egyptians, even workers, are buried with at least some provisions for the afterlife. The workers' cemetery here again is the evidence. Small tombs, modest grave goods, sometimes inscriptions, sometimes just a name. The belief that your heart will be weighed after death against the feather of Maat. Truth, balance, cosmic order, and that a life lived honestly without having done evil earns passage to a pleasant afterlife isn't reserved for kings. It's universal, or as close to universal as anything gets here. The pyramid you're building is for Khufu, but the moral framework that makes sense of your own existence, the idea that this life is a kind of test with a real outcome afterward, judged on real criteria, belongs to you too, in your small mudbrick room, as much as it belongs to him in his eventual granite chamber at the heart of a mountain of stone.
There's something almost vertiginous in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it. The same belief system that places the king at the literal center of the cosmos, infinitely above you, also tells you that your own heart will be weighed by exactly the same standard as his. The hierarchy is absolute, and the judgment is, in its way, equal, the same paradox in a different shape as the Roman bathhouse, where the senator and the freedman share the same water. Here, the senator and the laborer will, eventually, share the same scale.
The night, when it comes fast. This isn't the long Nordic twilight. The sun drops, and within a short stretch of time, true dark arrives, and with it, the stars.
Without cities, without significant light pollution, the night sky here is overwhelming, and it isn't just beautiful, it's functional. The same way it was for the Norse sailor, but read through an entirely different framework. Certain stars and constellations are identified with specific gods and concepts. The star Sirius, whose pre-dawn rising signals the coming of the Nile flood, is tracked with enormous care, because the flood is the single most important event of the entire year. The difference between abundance and famine, encoded in the appearance of one star on one morning. The night sky to the people lying in this village right now is a calendar, a religious text, and a clock, all at once, written across the dark in points of light that no one here has any reason to think of as just stars.
You lie down on the reed mat, the ache in your shoulders settling into something duller, something almost familiar now. Through the doorway, if you turned to look, you'd see it, the pyramid, dark against a darker sky, its unfinished top a jagged silhouette against the stars, lit faintly, near its base, by the last embers of cooking fires scattered through the village. It doesn't look, from here, like a wonder of the world. It looks like the place you'll be walking to again in a few hours, when the gray line at the doorway returns and the grinding of grain starts up again in 100 houses at once.
One last thought before sleep, because the question by now should feel familiar. Was it worth it?
The pyramid will outlast every person involved in building it by a margin so large, it's almost meaningless to state. 4,500 years and counting, still standing, still the subject of documentaries and theories and tourism, on a scale that dwarfs almost anything else from the ancient world. And it was built by people who were fed, mostly, and housed, mostly, and medically treated, sometimes remarkably well, and who also worked in heat that could kill them, ground their teeth to ruins on the grit in their bread, crossed a river with crocodiles in it twice a day, and did all of this for a king they would never meet, in service of a cosmic order that placed them, by birth, about as far from that king as a human being could be placed while still being human.
The pyramid and the worker are not separate stories. They're the same story. The way Rome's aqueduct and Rome's arena were the same story. The way the Norse sunstone and the Norse slave trade were the same story. The monument is made of stone, but it's also made of every blister, every heat, exhausted afternoon, every tooth ground down by sand, every gang name scrawled in red ochre by men who knew they'd never see the finished thing from any angle but the one they were standing at, hauling a rope when the foreman called the count.
The village has been doing this for years before tonight, and will keep doing it for years after. New rotations arriving as others leave, the pyramid growing by a course or two while you sleep. The river rising and falling on its yearly schedule, indifferent to all of it, the way it's indifferent to everything, the way rivers are. That's Egypt, not the gold mask, not the God King on his throne, not the smooth white casing stones gleaming in the sun, viewed from a distance by people who will never haul a single one of them. Just this, a mud-brick room, an aching back, a sky full of stars that tell you when the river will rise, and a mountain of stone still unfinished, waiting for you in the morning.
Close your eyes. You are in Giza tonight, and the pyramid will still be there in the morning. Sleep well.